Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are on planet Earth. We have some people where it's morning time, others where it's evening time, and some it's in the afternoon. Wherever you are very welcome. And thank you for joining us today in this monthly live class. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's really, really important. In fact, it's very, very important. A lot of us are aware of different reasons why we may or may not do well on the exam. Of course, the exam depends on your having a really good English level. The better your English level, the better you can do. Also, you definitely want to have really good study strategies on the exam. And so there are different reasons why you may not be doing as well as you think you can do. However, one big reason that people don't actually give enough credit to and don't talk about enough relates to managing test anxiety. And so today, what I'm going to be talking about is just that, managing test anxiety, to try to give you some advice about what it is, what are the causes, what are some specific exam causes of anxiety, and then, of course, what are some solutions. So let's go ahead and get started in talking about managing test anxiety. If you have any questions related to the class topic of managing test anxiety, I will eventually address your question that you have in the chat box. If you have a question about anything else, any other subject matter, anything else, ask your question in the Udemy course, not here, not now. Because when I do a live class, the live class is very, very focused and is focused on a singular specific topic. And we're not going to get off topic. We're not going to get out of focus. So if you have questions about some other subject matter or some other requests, ask in the course, not here, not now. So let's move on and talk about managing test anxiety. So what accounts for score drops of 1 to 2 points on the IELTS or 3 to 7 points on the TOEFL IBT? And this is very real. This is very, very true. There have been many, many studies about this, right? Managing test anxiety or stress or nervousness. If you mismanage it on the exam, on the IELTS, you're likely losing 1 to 2 points. On the TOEFL IBT, you're likely losing 3 to 7 points on the exam. Just because you were not able to manage your test anxiety very well. And so for some people that are taking the IELTS exam and they're stuck between a 6 and a 6.5, part of the reason why they may not be getting the score they want directly relates to test anxiety or the mismanagement of test anxiety. Or on the TOEFL IBT, if you're stuck at a 23 and you're trying to get above a 26, you're most likely losing some points related to test anxiety. And so it's very, very important that you understand what it's about, what are the causes, what is your specific anxiety that you have, and what you can do about it. So in today's live class, I'm going to be talking about what is test anxiety, how to recognize occurrences of anxiety, what is the impact of test anxiety, what are the general causes, what are the specific exam causes and effects, what are some common solutions, what are some uncommon solutions, and also I'm going to tell you no solution will work if you don't do this one thing. Right? Or I should say no solution will work very well if you don't do this one thing I'm going to talk about later on. And then finally, I'm going to discuss factors of increased performance. I'm going to let you know And again, this is something proven by study after study after study. What top students do that other students don't do, or what skills that top students use, or qualities that top students have that average students do not have. It's not a matter of intelligence. It's not a matter of knowing or not knowing strategy. There's certain qualities, characteristics of top students that if you're not at the top, you may be lacking in some of these areas. And if you're lacking in some of these areas, then you know exactly what you need to do to be able to really increase your overall performance. Now, I will say, and I will like to preface my comments by saying I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a medical technician like a nurse or something. You hold responsibility to read further about any recommendations that are made. I am not a doctor. Now, I do feel comfortable speaking and talking about this. I do have one of my degrees is a bachelor's of science in psychology. And that's one of my degrees. I have other degrees also, but that's one of my degrees. And so I do feel comfortable talking about the subject matter. And so, but again, anything that you're going to try, anything that you hear, please hold responsibility to read more about that on your own or get your own medical advice about something. So what is test anxiety? Very often when you hear these kind of comments, you know, students saying, I can't cope, I feel overwhelmed, I blank out, the walls are caving in, I'm so stupid, I'm doing really badly right now. That's the kind of language, right? That's the kind of language or the kind of self-talk that really is an indicator that you might be suffering from test anxiety. And really, I call test anxiety the unseen enemy because many students are not really familiar with it, intimately familiar with it. They understand what the word test means and what the word anxiety, but they're not really clear about how do I overcome it. When we talk about test anxiety, there are a couple of definitions I want to bring to mind. Number one, test anxiety is a learned behavior. You're not born with test anxiety. It is something, for the most part, that is is something that you learn. So anything that you learn, you can unlearn. But a lot of you have been practicing unknowingly. You've been practicing like getting better at your anxiety. You don't realize it, but it's a learned behavior. And for most of you, you just keep reinforcing that learned behavior over and over and over and over again. And like I said, it's something that happens on an unconscious level. When you feel that nervous feeling, that's a sign of anxiety. It interferes with student performance, right? And it's called test anxiety because it's a construct that is considered as a situation-specific trait. It's very, very specific to testing. And most of the time it deals with some type of standardized testing. And we really see evidence of anxiety on exams like the IELTS or the TOEFL IBT, because there's also the function of the clock or the test pressure. But the main point I'm trying to really explain here is that it's a learned behavior, and any learned behavior can be unlearned. So there are three components of test anxiety. Probably the most harmful component is the cognitive component of test anxiety. There are three components: the cognitive, the affective, and the behavioral. So when it comes to the cognitive component, like I said, this is the one that probably affects most students. The negative thoughts, the depreciating self-statements that occur during an assessment. If I fail this exam, my whole life is a failure. Probably some of you in this class today, before you're taking your IELTS exam or the TOEFL exam, you're thinking that, right? That's in your mind. If I don't get a 7, my whole life is finished. If I don't get that 23 or 26, my whole life is finished. And when you're doing that, when you're engaging in that kind of cognitive overload, you really are inhibiting your performance ability. You're stopping your ability to recall facts. You're having more difficulty in reading, understanding, listening. So the cognitive problem is really a big issue. And then another component is called the affective factor. And when we talk about the affective factors, we're talking about the emotional consequences. This is when a person is really feeling tension, tight muscles, trembling, right? There are some real affective or emotional things that are going on with the person. And then you have a behavioral component. And this relates to poor study skills, avoiding work, procrastinating work. So it's really important that you're able to discover your component. What is your test anxiety component? Is your component cognitive, affective, or behavioral? That's like the first step to getting better, is identifying what's my problem. What component of test anxiety am I suffering from? Because I don't want to lose 1 to 2 points or 3 to 7 points on my exam. Now, you guys hear me talking about the IELTS and the TOEFL, and that's actually because in this one class today, both of my Udemy classes are actually together. In this class right now, there are IELTS students and their TOEFL students. So this is probably the first time you guys have been brought together. But the reason why I brought you together is because what I'm talking about affects both exams exactly the same. So that's why you hear me talking about the IELTS and the TOEFL. So I want to mention that also. Both students are in this in this class today. So let's go over a couple of myths that are related to test anxiety. Myth number 1, students are born with test anxiety. No, you are not. No one is born with test anxiety. It's a learned behavior. Myth number 2, any level of test anxiety is bad. That is a myth. To do your very best, some stress, some anxiety is required. I'll say that one more time. To do your best on the exam, some anxiety, some stress is required. There's something that physiologically goes on in the body when you feel a certain level of stress that helps you to be at your peak performance. The key is that you want to stay in a certain zone of stress or a certain zone of anxiety. And when you're in that zone, that's when you're at your peak performance. That's why in sports, when you see people like Michael Jordan or Lionel Messi or Ronaldo or any of the greats, any great singer, any great performer, the ones that are great, they're able to stay in the zone, the stress zone, the anxiety zone. Others may have the same physical talents as they do, but they have not mastered that. And so I mention those people and mention this because when you're taking an exam like the IELTS or the TOEFL, it's a performance exam. It's a performance exam. Myth 3, very intelligent students do not have test anxiety. That is a huge myth. In fact, they're the ones with the most anxiety. And most of you guys are very intelligent, and that's why you suffer. Being told to relax during a test will make you relax. That is a myth. Doing nothing about test anxiety will make it go away. That is a huge myth. Hard work will reduce my test anxiety. That is a myth. Hard work will not reduce your test anxiety. Students who are well prepared will not have anxiety. And it is also a myth that test anxiety cannot be reduced. All right, does anyone have any questions before I go on to what's next? Any questions? Okay, Manuel, good question. Manuel says, is there any section of the exam that produces more anxiety than others? All right, good question, Manuel. I would say that for IELTS students and for TOEFL students, the part of the exam that probably produces more anxiety than any other is the reading part. The reading section for the IELTS and the reading section for the TOEFL are traditionally, not always, but for most students, those are the most difficult or the most anxiety increasing parts. Right now, thankfully, if you're doing the IELTS exam, you get to start with the listening. And then you move on to the reading part. However, with the TOEFL IBT, you actually start off with the reading part. And so it's really critical, if you're one of my TOEFL students, that you have your anxiety together from the very beginning, because you're taking the part of the exam that has the most anxiety. If you're doing the IELTS, you're starting off with the listening. The listening is probably one of the parts of the exam that has the least amount of anxiety. And so for IELTS students, at least you're starting off in not such in a section that can cause you problems. Okay, a couple other questions that I'll move on. How to overcome anxiety if I don't find some of the answers during the reading exam and I don't have enough stock of vocabulary during the writing exam. Yeah, what you're talking about, Rahul, is that you're not prepared, right? So what you're really asking me, Rahul, is how do I overcome my anxiety? Rahul is asking me, how do I overcome my anxiety when I don't have enough skill, right? When I don't have enough skill. So Rahul, the answer to your question is in your question. This is something you need to resolve before you take the test. Like, you need to make sure that you have enough vocabulary, because if you're really working to really increase your vocabulary and your synonym vocabulary, Rahul, then you won't have that anxiety problem in the exam. Once you're in the exam and you realize I don't have enough vocabulary, that does increase your anxiety. But really, the only thing you can do at that point, Rahul, is really try to, cognitively or emotionally or physically just use some kind of technique to reduce your anxiety. But you can't just magically get the skill. But you can reduce your anxiety so it doesn't affect you for the rest of the exam. Somebody's asked me, why is 6 or 7 not true? In terms of number 6, hard work will reduce my test anxiety. There have been a lot of studies, and I've read the studies. Students that get, for example, an 8 or a 9 on the IELTS, or a 26 or 28 on the TOEFL, and students that get a 5 or 6 on the IELTS or get an 18 to 20 on the TOEFL, they both work hard, right? They both work hard. And so hard work doesn't really reduce your test anxiety. What reduces your test anxiety is working right. There's a difference between hard work and working right. Also, just because you're well prepared, so for number 7, just because you're well prepared doesn't mean you won't have anxiety, right? You can be prepared and still have anxiety. Now, if you are prepared, it will be less. It will be less, but it doesn't mean you won't get it, right? And so if you get it, you have to know what to do.